Alright, welcome back to Unfolding Three Body. The first season is officially out. I'm sure many of you have already binged all 8 episodes, and thus have a massive head start on me. I'm disappointed, but not at all surprised that Netflix didn't parcel the release a little, like giving us half a season, then providing a break. But it is what it is. I decided to only watch the first 2 episodes, then share my reactions with you all before moving on. The way we'll do this is, we'll run through episodes 1 and 2, recapping and examining them more or less as a standalone television entity, and not spoil anything from the plot of the books. Then at the end, I'll reference the original story with some discussion and predictions and book spoilers about where the show might be going, compared to the trajectory in the books. Let's get started. We begin with a cold open to Tsinghua University in Beijing in 1966 during the Cultural Revolution. There's an ardent mob of supporters gathered at a struggle session where members of the Red Guard are putting academics on trial for their reactionary crimes. I'm sure many of you already know this, but this scene is very much a reference to real-life events, and people were imprisoned and killed for the great sin of scientific research. I read somewhere recently that in the Chinese publication of the Three-Body Problem, this scene was tucked away later in the story to avoid CCP censorship, but that the English translator recommended moving it to the beginning, a decision that Cixin Liu later agreed with, allegedly. Here we're introduced to Ye Wenjie standing anxiously in the crowd as her father, Ye Zhitai, is brought onto the stage, his face bruised and bloodied, a heavy iron plate hung around his neck, and interrogated for thought crime. His defiance, i.e. straightforward, logical answers, only serves to enrage the Red Guard, which reaches a climax when he is asked if he believes God exists, and he responds simply that there's no scientific evidence one way or another. This question seems pretty intentionally a theme in this episode, coming up again later. It's at this point that this virtue performance becomes ritualistic murder as they beat him to death before a cheering mob. Without saying more, I was worried about how this scene would go, as I think it's one of the more important moments in this story. As we'll see, episode 1 is in large part telling the origin story of Ye Wenjie and how hideous a journey her early life was. They really needed to stick the landing here, and honestly, they did. I thought Seng Jinne, who plays Ye Wenjie, gave an absolutely killer performance. Her agony and despair, calling out for her Baba, sobbing as she watches his brutal murder, cradling his lifeless head and placing his pipe in his hand in the aftermath. And of course the look she gives the female Red Guard who dealt the killing blow, that sorrow congealing into hatred. I was genuinely moved by all of it, which is incredible considering we've known this character for all of 4 minutes. It just speaks to the power of her performance. I'd also like to add that this was all extremely faithful to the book. It's at this point we get the title sequence for Three-Body Problem, with this zoom out from a molecular back to a cosmic scale, and an original song by Ramin Djawadi that has some strong shades of Westworld. I thought this title sequence was solid, if unspectacular. I think the era of iconic title sequences like Game of Thrones, True Detective, Narcos, to name a few, has come and gone, and isn't so much a priority anymore for studios, which is a shame. I'm not hating on this one, I think it's perfectly fine. Fast forward to London in 2024, we're introduced to Da Shi at a residence of a scientist who has evidently killed himself in rather gruesome fashion. Seems like a bit of a nod to Event Horizon with the eyes and such. Nice touch. Cut to Oxford, where we meet Saul Durand questioning his career choices. We also briefly meet Vera Ye. Here, the granddaughter of Ye Zhitai asks her colleague if he believes in God just before she commits suicide. This question of whether God exists, heralding both of their deaths, is an interesting theme, and I'm guessing the showrunners will revisit it as the season goes on. We then meet Augie and Jin, who provide a little more detail on the mysterious brick wall that the scientific community has hit. This is also where Augie starts having the visual hallucinations, for lack of a better word. I have a bit of a nit to pick here. I think the countdown effect was a little over the top. I know we're supposed to feel like this is extremely disconcerting to the person it's happening to, but I think this is a situation where sometimes less is more. Maybe they didn't trust the audience member to imagine that numbers flashing in your visual field would be unsettling in and of itself. I think you just keep it simple and leave it up to the actor to convey how freaked out they are. But more on this later. There's an obligatory scene with a detective's picture board with all of our principal characters on it as Da Shi X's out Vera Ye. We then meet Jack and Will before Vera Ye's funeral. We also learn that Jack is a bit of an ass and owns his own chip company. By the way, if anyone can confirm whether Walker's Cheese and Onion and Monster Munch Beef are actual flavors of crisps in the UK, I'm dying to know. Either way, excellent. Also, we get some interesting backstory that Will has a thing for gin. This is a bit of table setting for future events, something I think book readers picked up on immediately, more later. During the funeral scene, we also get an introduction to Mike Evans with a silent exchange of looks between him, the late Vera, and her mother. In the post-funeral debrief at the bar, Our party of 5 is catching up, and we get a little more romantic backstory that there's some kind of history between Augie and Saul. Then later, Augie goes out for a cig, where a mysterious stranger confronts her about her visual hallucinations and how she can make them stop. By the way, the cigarette smoking everyone does in the show, public health implications aside, is rather expertly done, Dasha especially. Back in 1967, we see Yu and Jia at a labor camp felling trees at Red Coast Base. She meets Bai Mu-lin here, and a bit of warmth is introduced into her desolate existence. There's a great line during this initial exchange where they're looking across the felled forest, and he says to her, "You must have considered the consequences of all this destruction." File that under obvious foreshadowing. Yu and Jia and Bai Mu-lin have some tender moments during this montage, and you get the feeling that it's too good to be true. And of course, that little flower that has survived a raging inferno immediately gets ground to a pulp as the guards find her copy of Silent Spring, accusing her of crimes against the state, as Bai Mu-lin cravenly stands there offering no defense on her behalf. I don't think this is a spoiler, so I'll say it here, but it's even worse in the book. Bai Mu-lin completely throws her under the bus, rather than it being bad luck and him not having the courage to own up. Pretty bad. Yu and Jia is then transferred to a prison where a party official by the name of Teng Li-hua attempts to coerce a signature from her that would incriminate innocent people, which Wen-jia is unwilling to do. Gotta say, superb casting of Jin Yuan in this small role of Teng Li-hua. She's so serpentine and bureaucratic, with that manufactured politeness and contemptuous smile, looking right down her nose at Yu and Jia. Quite loathsome. Great job, Jin Yuan. Yu and Jia gets transferred to Red Coast Base, meets Yang Wei-ning, who in the books is a former student of hers. Without hesitation, she accepts their offer to work there, possibly for the remainder of her life. All super tight with the book. We get Dasho on a call with his boss, Thomas Wade, and we see the VR headset come into play. Pretty strong intro for Liam Cunningham's Thomas Wade, who I'm most excited about for the show, and the "no smoking in here" line definitely got a chuckle out of me. We see Jin spending time with Vera's mother, the VR headset exchanges hands, and then we learn that Vera's mom is in fact the grown-up Yu and Jia. The choice to have Yu and Jia give her the headset is odd, but we'll cover that at the end of the show. Jin takes the headset and enters the game world, which in the books is called 3body.net. The episode closes with Augie and Saul in the university courtyard waiting for the universe to wink, interlaced with the Red Coast Base commander and chief engineer Yang Wei-ning, revealing to Yu and Jia the true nature of their activities. Midnight strikes, and everyone watching sees the stars flicker in periodic blackness, tapping out Morse code for the countdown that Augie has been seeing. Another tiny nit to pick here, the visual effect of the universe flickering. It's not that it's a bit of cinematic flourish. In the books, it's a flickering of the cosmic microwave background radiation that can only be seen with special equipment. It's all fine that they had to make it more salient for us. It's the damn starry sky. In London. I'm not some expert in stargazing, but I've been at the top of Kilimanjaro in the middle of the night, and it was maybe 1/100th of what they were looking at. I get it, they wanted to make it impressive, but it kind of took me out of the moment. I thought this was a solid first episode, highlighted by Seng Jine's portrayal of Yu and Jia. She was the clear winner of this episode in my eyes, which is important because she clearly has a critical role in this story. We don't get a lot from Da Shi, who many book readers were really looking forward to. It's a workmanlike performance by Benedict Wong, and we don't get much of a feel. I'm hoping this is just a matter of evolving the character slowly. I gotta admit, I wasn't crazy about the Augie performance. It's a little bland, a little breathless. In the last part of the show, we'll get into the implications of her character as well as Jin's and what these show choices might mean for the way that they tell the story. Now let's recap episode 2. We start with Yu and Jia watching news reports of the mysterious flickering event, and she seems puzzled. Saul visits her, pays his respects to Vera. Saul expresses his doubts about the veracity of the phenomenon. Again, this is a show choice, a slight departure from the book, as we discussed. Maybe insignificant. In the next scene, we get Augie in her lab conducting a demonstration of the fiber that she's been working on. A clear Chekhov's gun, or Chekhov's nanomaterial moment here. The demonstration is a success, but she caves to the pressure, shuts down operations, and the countdown stops. Da Shi makes his introduction to her. And title sequence. Abbreviated title sequence, by the way. Yu and Jia and Yang Wei-ning sitting at Radar Peak chatting about the Fermi paradox. Here's the first tiny hint of something I think was one of the greatest attributes of the books. Cosmic sociology, the game theory of the universe. We'll get into it more in the last segment, but I sincerely hope that this is not ignored in the adaptation. Yu and Jia at her station, listening to space music. Wen-jia explains to Wei-ning her hypothesis of solar amplification, only to later be betrayed as he steals credit for the discovery. One more slap in the face of poor Yu and Jia. We then see her at the control panel surreptitiously redirecting the radar dish to point at the sun and test her hypothesis. On an aside, the set design here is excellent. The 70s style equipment, the color, it almost has a Wes Anderson vibe to it. Cut to Augie, interrogated by Da Shi. More description of her work, more foreshadowing of its potential impact. There's a pretty great line here from Da Shi.
And I think I disappointed her because I quit her course and switched into applied science.
Maybe that's why she killed herself.
First glimpse of the sarcastic dickishness of the book Da Shi that was so memorable. Hope we get more of that later. Jin enters the massive multiplayer world of 3body.net, where she's promptly introduced to the Count of the West and a follower. I thought this whole scene was well done and funny in a way that's a pleasant addition to the books. Jin shares her discovery with Jack, who tries on the headset, tastes some dirt, then is promptly kicked out of the game by, well, more on this in the last segment. I'm enjoying this Jack character, by the way. John Bradley has given a solid and amusing performance thus far, with a bit more comedic range than we got with Samwell Tarly in Game of Thrones. Some backstory about Saul and Augie, followed by some backstory about Da Shi, who meets the mysterious stranger from episode 1, who we find out was lying about her father. Jack then comes home to find out he's been called up to the big leagues. I've knocked them for the visual effects in the first episode, but all the video game stuff is first rate. From the warp-in effect to the virtual environments, montage of Will teaching and getting the worst of news, overlaid on a lecture about the many worlds hypothesis. Here's where we get some indication about what this character, who is not in the books by this name, will be. Again, we'll cover in the last segment. Great use of the Rolling Stones here, by the way. We get Jin in bed, logging some serious hours in 3body.net. I really enjoy these game sequences. I think that the set design and execution is really well done. One thing I thought was funny about both the books and TV adaptation is that, aside from our protagonists in the game, all the game characters like Emperor Zhou and the Count of the West, despite being roles played by real humans logged into the game, have to essentially stay in character for whatever era of history they're in, and pretend they don't know terms like physics. I also enjoyed Put Your Hand on the Ground. Speeds up time. The Count's prediction about a stable era is put to the test, and the masses are gloriously rehydrated. The scenes between Jin and follower feel like character building, and I think it's a distinct choice by the showrunners, something we'll again get into at the end of the show. The joys of hydration, however, are short-lived, as Civilization 137 enters an ice age almost immediately, and Jin reaches follower just as she goes all T-1000. Game ends as the narrator of the game gives Jin a recap. We then get a sit-down between Da Shi and Boss Wade, where we hear about the WoW signal in 1977, and a subsequent connecting of the dots between the UNGS storyline and present day, as well as Mike Evans. Flashback to 1977, where UNGA meets Mike Evans and his quest to save an endangered species. Silent Spring re-enters the equation, and we're left to believe that a romantic connection is in the works. UNGA finally gets a face-to-face with the Red Guard member most responsible for her father's death, now missing an arm, as well as any remorse for her villainy. The girl is still an absolute monster, and tells UNGA that if she could go back, she'd once again scythe her father like wheat. How badly do you want UNGA to get her vengeance on this wretched thing? Instead, it's just one more perfect portrait of human ugliness that she's left to bury in her hard heart, one that has already festered for her entire adult life. Finally, we see UNGA, headphones on, again listening to space music, when an incontrovertible signal comes in. The signal is a chilling warning from a benevolent member of an otherwise dangerous civilization, pleading with her not to respond. But in the one in a trillion way that all the gears of misfortune can sometimes line up so perfectly, the person who receives this message is one whose heart has been irrevocably poisoned by her fellow man. Once again, she lines up the dish with our nearest star, and after a heart-pounding moment of hesitation, the press of a button condemns the world. Cut to black. Again, really loved all the UNGA scenes from the past. Awesome performance by Sang Jin-eh. Game sequences are really good. Still not loving Augie. Got more glimpses of Thomas Wade, excited to see more. And maybe a little light from Da Shi, which I'm not mad at. At this point, we're going to get into some heavy book spoilers, so this is your chance to cover your virgin ears. If that's the case, I'll see you next time. As this first episode is essentially a meet and greet with our principal players, the question that seems most pressing to book readers is, who's who? Indications based on screen time, the visual hallucinations, and relationship to nanomaterials seem to pretty clearly indicate that Augie is Wang Miao. The other fairly obvious one is Will Downing being Yun Tianming, who isn't introduced till the third book, Death's End. He loves Jin from afar, he's terminally ill. I'm pretty sure they're shooting that dude's brain into space by next season. The Raj character seems like he could be the Zhang Beihai equivalent, though that may simply be the military background and the opportunity for the showrunners to have both Will and Raj leave Jin forever. The others I'm a little less clear on to this point of the show. In the books, Ding Yi is Yang Dong, i.e. Vera Ye's boyfriend, and ends up a fairly important character. Saul is closest to Vera at the time of her death. He's a physicist. Maybe that's the direction he goes in. Chang Xin is Jin, though it's interesting that she spends the most time in the game, whereas in the books it's the Wang Miao character. I don't think that's a big deal. And who knows what Jack is? Not sure how the comedic relief potato chip magnate fits into the picture, but As far as the decision to introduce most of the characters at once, I don't necessarily have a problem with it. As I said in the preview, having more thread to weave interpersonal relationships is a good thing, as is having more time to develop the individual characters. I just hope this isn't the entire roster from the whole trilogy. I think I'd be most disappointed if one of them becomes the Luo Ji character. I just don't see him in any of the current cast. And based on the Episode 8 title alone, it looks like we'll know who he is by the end of the season. Another reason why I wouldn't be crazy about every principal character being introduced in the first episode is simply plausibility. Are we to believe that every person who plays an outsized role in the fate of mankind came from the same group of college buddies? It's the League of Extraordinary Physicists. As for the others, the Thomas Wade portrayal is promising. Liam Cunningham is every bit the intimidating, brooding figure. We don't see the menace or coldness just yet, but I see him setting up to fill the shoes nicely. Not sure why the Dasha character is so muted. In the books, he's irreverent, a little abrasive, razor sharp, with a heart of gold. Benedict Wong is a good actor. I don't think there's any downside to letting us see these facets of his personality right off the bat, but for some reason he just seems a bit square. And of course they knocked it out of the park with the younger Yu Wenjie. She's the true villain of the first book, and I was pleasantly surprised with how much the adaptation made me empathize with her, much more so than in the books. It's good storytelling. If the showrunners follow the arc of the books, I think Jin's character development will be a challenge. She's a brilliant physicist, and the show has already started portraying her in type, a thinker rather than a feeler in that Myers-Briggs kind of way. But in the books, it's Chang Xin's overwhelming humanity that made her the absolute worst choice as sword holder. It's what made the Trisolarans just about 100% sure that they could attack unfettered. Yes, brilliant people can have feelings, I'm not saying otherwise, but as they develop this Jin character, they'll have to convince us that she's someone whose weakness for people could completely override logic and calculation. Maybe that's what her interactions with the little girl in the game are about. As far as her getting the headset from Yu Wenjie, I can only assume that Yu Wenjie planned this, and that's why Jin didn't need an invitation to play. But then that presumes that Yu Wenjie saw Jin as a potential ally rather than a security threat. It's not a plot hole, just interesting. Ah yes, and I can't forget the arrival of Sofan. They made it obvious in the trailer that she'd be in this season, but her introduction as the moderator of the game, highly unexpected to say the least. I would imagine that she shows up in the real world at some point as well, but using her in the game was an amusing touch. I'm curious and perhaps concerned to see what the next couple episodes hold. It's becoming apparent that the story told in the books will be compressed way down in this adaptation. The question is, how much? One of the best parts of Cixin Liu's books, for the fans of the story, was the long game. It was a few humans playing chess over hundreds of years against a more advanced opponent, and one who can see to a certain extent what you're planning to do next. It's also the question of what happens to a civilization doomed to die but not for 400 years. What happens to the birth rate, to the economy, to world order? The evolution of a slow pre-apocalypse would be a fascinating thing to bring to the screen, but if, for example, the showrunners simply make it so the Trisolarans can travel at light speed just to cram everything in, we're gonna lose a lot of what made this story so great. In the official trailer for the show, they showed a glimpse of some ring-like structure in near-Earth orbit, and my first thought was, great, it's a portal. The Trisolarans are just gonna Einstein-Rosenbridge their way to our doorstep. Fantastic. Maybe I'm just jumping to conclusions. If you have your own insights based on what we've seen in the first 2 episodes, let me know in the comments below. I'm also quite certain that many of you are much further into the show and can chuckle about all the things that I got wrong here. I'm looking forward to catching up. Okay, that's a wrap. I'll see you back here for the next breakdown of episodes 3 and 4.